let's have a look at the first area of global financial management, which is all about exchange rates, before moving on in the next video to look at hedging and derivatives. So first of all, what are exchange rates and what issues do they cause for the business? Exchange rates are simply the value of one currency in terms of another. Now, exchange rates are constantly changing to reflect the different demand and supply of currencies in the foreign exchange market. This in itself isn't a problem. The difficulty actually arises not because they're changing, but because those changes are unpredictable and they're adding uncertainty into global financial transactions. Because it's difficult to plan and budget for overseas revenue and expenditure, because the actual realised value in terms of Australian dollars may be different to what was expected. We may have to pay more Australian dollars than we had planned for our overseas inputs, or we might be receiving less than we planned, or it could change our level of international competitiveness for exporters. The key here is to remember that the impact of exchange rate movements will really depend on the nature of the financial transactions that are conducted by the business. So what type of transactions are they involved with? Are they buying from overseas? So are they an importer? Or are they selling to overseas? Are they an exporter? Or thirdly, are they borrowing from overseas? Depending on which of these they are, the exchange rate movement will have a different impact for them. So the two types of exchange rate movements that we're going to have a look at are appreciations and depreciations. Let's start by having a look at appreciations. So simply put, an appreciation is an increase in the purchasing power of a currency. So if the Australian dollar appreciates, one Australian dollar will buy more of the foreign currency than it did previously. Now this is positive for businesses who are importers, along with businesses that have borrowed from overseas. But an appreciation is actually going to be negative for businesses who are exporters. So let's have a look at the reasons as to why. Firstly, an appreciation is positive for importers and businesses that borrow from overseas for the following reasons. Firstly, Australian businesses need to pay their foreign suppliers and creditors in foreign currency. An appreciation means that every Australian dollar buys more of the foreign currency than it did previously. This means that less Australian dollars are going to be needed to pay those accounts or the interest or loan repayments. So, the actual Australian dollar amount of the transaction is lower than was expected, so therefore it's a good thing for those businesses. However, an appreciation is actually negative for Australian businesses that are exporters. And this is because Australian exporters need to be paid by their foreign customers in Australian dollars. An appreciation means that every foreign dollar now buys less Australian dollars than it did before. So this makes Australian goods and services now relatively more expensive than they were before the appreciation. What this does is it reduces the business's level of international competitiveness and probably future sales as well, because Australian goods are now more expensive because it costs those foreign customers more in terms of their currency to pay us in Australian dollars. Let's have a look now at the impacts of a depreciation. A depreciation is just a decrease in the purchasing power of a currency. If the Australian dollar depreciates, one Australian dollar will now buy less of the foreign currency than it did previously. This time, it's going to be negative for businesses who are importers, as well as businesses that have borrowed from overseas. However, it's going to be positive for Australian businesses that are exporters. So let's have a look as to why. A depreciation is negative for importers and businesses that are going to be borrowing from overseas for the following reasons. Firstly, Australian importers and businesses that have borrowed from overseas need to pay their suppliers and creditors in foreign currency. A depreciation of the Australian dollar means that one Australian dollar now is going to buy less of each dollar of foreign currency than it did previously. So what that means is we need more Australian dollars to pay those accounts or loan repayments. So the actual Australian dollar of the value, the Australian dollar value of that transaction has actually gone up, making that transaction more expensive than it previously was. Why is a depreciation positive for exporters though? Australian exporters need to be paid by foreign customers in Australian dollars. A depreciation means that every foreign dollar is going to buy more Australian dollars than it did previously. This therefore makes Australian goods and services cheaper in terms of for our foreign customers because they have to pay less of their currency to be able to get these goods and services. So this improves the Australian exporters' level of international competitiveness and probably their level of future sales as well. So in summary, exchange rates are simply the value of one currency in terms of another. They are constantly changing. And as a result of this, it's going to create uncertainty and may change the actual Australian dollar value of the transaction. An appreciation means the Australian dollar is now worth more in terms of foreign currencies. It's good for importers and businesses who have borrowed from overseas, but it is negative for businesses that are exporters. Alternatively, a depreciation means that the Australian dollar is worth less in terms of foreign currencies. It's going to be good for exporters because it's going to improve their level of international competitiveness, but negative for importers and businesses who have borrowed from overseas because they're going to have to pay more Australian dollars than they had previously for those accounts or loan repayments.